right, we are now recording. I sure hope, depending on technology. So first off, welcome to the meeting this evening. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Wes Bryant. I am the president of the Elizabeth Community Association, also known as the ECA. We have several other board members on the call this evening. Evan is one of our panelists who's walking around his home right now. The subject of our meeting tonight is really to run through, have an information session, run through a proposed set of updates to the ECA's bylaws. The board unanimously approved this draft to bring to the membership as an initial proposal. You may or may not know that the ECA, besides being a community association, obviously is a nonprofit organization, and it is governed by a set of bylaws, and so those bylaws are quite important for that reason. And we're currently operating under bylaws that were written in 1979. A lot of things have changed in those 44 years, give or take. And so Sarah has put in a lot of research and a lot of work to help us put together an updated set of bylaws that's more appropriate for 2023 and hopefully for many years to come. Our agenda tonight, we'll start with kind of a review of the timeline that we're trying to hit, because what we're working up to is a vote for the membership to adopt a new set of bylaws. So that's kind of where we're going. And this is our first meeting as part of that. I'll then turn the mic over to Sarah, who is our resident expert. Thank you again, Sarah, to walk through the proposed bylaws and kind of highlight what we're including in there, what's changed, why we're changing it, and some of the benefits that will come along with adopting these new bylaws for the membership, for the community at large, and for the board. And then after she's done with that, we'll open up for questions. For the questions tonight, we'll use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And also, if you do have a question after the meeting or have a problem with the question feature within Zoom, please just feel free to email me as well, president@elizabethcommunity.com. And I see there's an initial question, so let me go to that real quick. And yes, chat is disabled for participants. Feel free to text with one another and stuff after the meeting. Now it's actually the default for webinars, so that's how it was set up there. Ken, thank you for the question there. So from a timeline perspective, I'll run through that real quick. So the first step, so we've got the bylaws to this point, and we're very excited to bring this to the membership and review it. So that's this meeting tonight. After we have this meeting, we want to get all the feedback via Q&A in this meeting, and also we'll keep accepting that feedback until roughly May 3rd. And the reason May 3rd is we want to be able to take that feedback and feed it into any changes or updates based on the feedback from the community, and then have the board discuss it in our May meeting. Assuming that all goes well, we'll try to turn those bylaws, if there's any changes, and turn those bylaws back around to the neighborhood for distribution roughly the second week of May, and then have a final review and comment meeting. And I'd like to do that in person if we can, in the mid to late May timeframe. Really trying to get this done before the summer starts, because a lot of people go away and want to have as many members active in the process as we can. That meeting in late May or mid to late May was TBD on the date, and we will have that meeting. And if all goes well, we'll have the vote we'll start in that meeting, and then like we did with the board election over the last few years during COVID, we'll hold that meeting open and accept votes via email as well. Again, to get as many inputs from the neighborhood as we can. So that's the timeline. I'll go through that one more time before we leave. And without further ado, Sarah, if you don't mind, if you could kind of take us through the new proposed bylaws so that we understand them better.
Sure. Well, hey, everybody. I think I know everyone who's on the call, and I really do appreciate your attending on what really is a beautiful evening outside those windows behind this laptop screen out my front door. I'm Sarah Crowder, and many of you know that I'm used to practice law. I'm retired as a lawyer, and I'm going to give my disclaimer right now that in writing these bylaws, I am not practicing law. I'm not representing the ECA. I didn't get paid to do this. It's just something that needed to happen. And we did consult, as we said in the summary that I wrote, we did consult with an attorney who is a specialist in nonprofit law. So we did not just rely on me, although I used to work at practice law at Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools and have a fair amount of experience in drafting documents like this and reading them. In doing this, of course, we went back to what we know to be the bylaws of the ECA adopted in 1979, and also researched using some bylaws from other well-known and established and respected neighborhood associations. So we weren't starting in a vacuum. There had also been a couple of stabs, probably 15 or 20 years ago, to rewrite the bylaws. We could never find evidence that those were adopted, but it looked like a lot of thought had gone into those, so we drew a little bit from that. Also, anyone who may have been on the board in the 1980s, I'm kind of talking to you, Ken or Mickey, I don't know about y'all, or Paul, there is some, I spent a day reading old newsletters, which was really fascinating, and as many board minutes as I could find. And there is some evidence or some information that there were amendments to the bylaws in the 1980s and maybe mid-90s, but I could never find an adopted draft. And the Articles of Incorporation, which contained the original 1979 bylaws, have those bylaws in them, and they had never been amended either. So given that, we thought, we should just start clean. And we were also, we did not produce a red line or black line, however you all refer to a track changes copy, because it was really just more work to do that than just to rewrite the bylaws. So this is basically a restatement of the bylaws. I hope everyone's had a chance to look at this summary that I wrote, and I think it's fairly reliable, but to really every word is in the draft document that Wes did send out. I'll say up front that we did not change any of the purposes of the ECA. We reordered them a little bit, but they are still the purposes that were written by Leslie Winter and probably Dan Clodfelter in 1979. Same purposes. And there may be a group that would look at those later, but we didn't think that was appropriate to do at this time. Before I go further, I meant to say this. I became ECA president in 2019, and I had not been on the board prior to that since sometime in the 1990s when my kids were little. And one of the first things I did was try to find the bylaws, and we could not find a reliable set of amended bylaws. And it was my intention when I was president to redraft the bylaws or have a committee do that. And if you remember 2019 into 2020, a lot of things happened. And so that just did not occur. It was also my intention to rewrite the bylaws after I ceased being president in September 2021. And some of you know we had a major health crisis in my family, not with me. And so I could not start working on them till last summer. So that's when we met with the executive committee and started plowing through the bylaws. So that's kind of the timeline. So back to the just a summary. As I said, the purposes have not changed. We have updated and corrected our tax exempt status to reflect that we're a 501c4. That happened over 20 years ago for the ECA and should have been, excuse me, updated in the bylaws at that time or the articles of incorporation, and it was not. So that is a necessary change. Going on down to Article 3, membership. This is essentially the same as the old bylaws, but it is a little bit different from what is evolved as the current practices. I will say that the 79 bylaws set the dues at $3 for a year. Now, you would never in this day and age put the dues amount in the bylaws. So that is definitely changed to be something that the board can set rather than requiring a bylaws amendment to change the dues. And they're certainly more than $3 now. There is evidence they went up to $5 in like 1984. But one bigger change from a current practice that I've noted in my Article 3 summary is that members will get one vote each. Now, that's consistent with the old bylaws, but it's at some point, the practice in the ECA evolved to one vote per household. That has been hard to manage. And it also, households different in their composition, and it didn't seem kind of a good practice or fair to say that, if you're a couple living together, that you get one vote, although you may both be members of the ECA. So that would be different. Article 4 on the board of directors, this is a big change from current practice, but it's not so much from the way the board was comprised in 1979. Right now, we have 15 members, and we've had 15 members for as long as anyone can remember. The original bylaws had 9 members, 4 officers and 5 other people. We recommend that we continue a 15-member board of directors with 5 officers and 10 directors. Now, the officers would be elected by the membership to those particular positions. Now, that's different from how a lot of corporate boards do it, where you would elect a whole board and then they would elect their officers. The practice in the ECA for 43 years has been that the membership elects officers to those particular positions. For directors, it would be a change. Right now, all of you probably would remember that when we have board elections, the person who's the chair of the newsletter committee, who is John McBride, of course, he's elected to that position. Our social chair, Lauren Gomez, is elected to that position, as is Nikki Moore, the social chair. We thought that really didn't make a lot of sense to elect people to committee positions when committees really should be more fluid and people should be appointed to committees who have an expertise and a passion in that area, a desire to be in that position. So our recommendation is that we have 5 officers who are elected and then 10 other people who would be elected by majority vote at the annual meeting. And then from those people, the president of the ECA would appoint people as chairs of committees. Now, any president who's got a brain in their head is going to appoint people to a committee that they're qualified to chair, they want to chair. Like, you would not put me in charge of the newsletter. No. But John McBride is perfect as long as he continues to want to do that. Same with traffic, same with social. So that would be a change so that the election for those 10 people would basically be an at-large election. We would change the terms to 2-year terms. They're currently 1-year terms with no term limits, i.e. no limit on the number of times people could run. And this would be, the next thing would be a significant change to what has evolved as the practice, but it's not different from how the original bylaw set it up. We recommend that we stagger the election cycle so that in even years, 8 people are elected, and in odd years, 7 people are elected. And that's easy to administer, except for the first year. And so we invented this procedure at the top of the second page of the summary that for 2023, 8 of the 15 people on the board would be elected to 1-year terms, and then they would stand for election again in 2024 for 2-year terms. And 7 people would be elected to their 2-year term. I mean, you've got to figure out some way to start a staggered term when you're basically starting over. So that would be our recommendation there. And the nominating committee would figure out who is in the 1-year term group and who's in the 2-year term group so that it makes sense with the officers, so that all your officers wouldn't have to be reelected in 2024. Another change is that, and I'll tell you, I'm not looking at questions because I can't do that and concentrate on what I'm doing now. So Wes, let me know if I need to answer something.
Yeah, I think we're good for now. And Ken, you had several. We'll make sure we answer those at the end.
I'm still in the board section that there's no compensation allowed for board members, period. The old bylaws would permit people to be compensated if they perform services for the ECA that's not part of their duties or actions as a board member. So that, for instance, I could have been hired to write these bylaws for the ECA, or someone could be hired, racking my brain for something like, but law is kind of the thing that comes most clearly to my mind. But the executive committee thought that that really puts board members in an unfair position vis-a-vis the rest of the neighborhood or the rest of the universe of people who might be qualified to do these jobs, to be competing for the contract with the ECA to perform services for the ECA. So our firm recommendation is, if you're a board member, you're just not allowed to be paid for anything you do for the ECA. Let's see, another big change is that this is now in North Carolina law that virtual meetings are allowed. We're glad because we, along with thousands of other boards, have been meeting virtually for a couple of years now, although we're moving back to in-person meetings. And this also defines what a quorum is, and it would be 2/3 of the currently seated board members. So out of a 15-member board, that's usually 10 people. And for some reason you have fewer, you would just have to do the math and figure out what's 2/3. And another change is that anyone on the board has to serve on a committee or chair a committee, and that's different now. And we have some at-large members who have been very valuable to the board, but they haven't had specific jobs. And we thought it's the best practice for board involvement to have everyone on the board serving, at least serving on a committee, if not chairing one. Let's see. In the officers section, the officers are the executive committee. They can act for the board, but they have to report to the board what they do. And then, of course, the board could vote to override that. People who are officers must be a member of the ECA and a resident. And I skipped over in the membership section, but this is consistent with what we do now, that people who don't live in Elizabeth but who work here are eligible to be a member of the ECA, as are representatives of businesses or houses of faith or anything like that. So, but if you are an officer, you're only qualified to be an officer if you actually live in the neighborhood. And when we say live in the neighborhood, we don't mean own a home here. We mean live in the neighborhood, rent or own, or roommates or whatever. Article 6 is new, and our lawyer suggested strongly that we should add this, and all the other bylaws I looked at have this. It's a disqualification section. So how could someone be removed from the board if they are just not attending meetings and don't have any reason not to? Or if they're corrupt, or if they're not performing their duties. And we didn't have fun talking about this section, but we thought it was important to do. And it also clarifies the role of the membership in this action as well. It's not a good idea not to have this kind of provision. So we have written it in, and it's summarized here on what it takes to remove a board member. It's not a trivial process, and it would be a serious process, but we thought we needed to include it in the bylaws. Membership meetings is Article 7. We have defined what a quorum is. We have defined how people are nominated to the board, which is not in the current bylaws. So in the absence of a bylaw provision, practices have evolved depending on who's president and who's on the board. And when I became president, and then West succeeded me, which I'm very happy he did. Thank you, West. We put in place a nominating committee process, and that's what we have been using for the last couple of years for nominations to the board and also for vacant board positions. So that is outlined here in Article 8 when we get to that, and it's rather detailed. The elections process is also defined in the bylaws in Article 7, and that is not addressed in the current bylaws. So this is what several other organizations do in Charlotte neighborhood, nonprofits like Dilworth and Plaza Midwood, to just make the process more manageable for a volunteer organization. So that the nominating committee puts together a slate which the board approves. And you can have 1 or 2 people for each position. Could be 1, could be 2. That is publicized to the membership. At the annual meeting, there are no nominations from the floor, but nominations may be made by members prior to the meeting, and the process is outlined here. There needs to be a written petition from at least 15 members of the ECA with the consent of the candidate that's sent it to the chair of the nominating committee 1 week before the meeting. And we've done that the last couple of years. So this gives us then the nominating committee, the president, the ability to publicize all that and put a ballot together. There will be a printed ballot for an in-person voter meeting, and we hope we can start to have in-person annual meetings again this year. The board will figure out a process if we have to do hybrid or vote virtually. And members, as I said earlier, vote for each officer by particular position. And then for the number of vacant director positions open, there's 1 vote for candidate. It's an at-large election, and the highest vote getters win. So that's some detail about this, and it's outlined a little bit more detail about the nominating committee in Article 8. So Article 8 is about committees. There are special committees which the president appoints, and then there are 2 standing committees that are the executive and nominating committee. So special committees are what we have now: newsletter, transportation, land use, social, you name it. And then that gives the board flexibility to develop committees as the need arises, because the world, as we know, is changing. Chairs of committees must be board members. And as I said earlier, if you're a director and you're not a committee chair, you need to pick a committee and be on a committee. And then the board will approve annual budgets for committees and for the organization. Article 9 is not something that's addressed in the current bylaws. There's no conflict of interest policy that we have been able to find for the ECA, and we think any board needs a conflicts policy. But rather than write it into the bylaws, our recommendation is that the bylaws direct the board to adopt a conflicts policy. And that makes it easier to change the conflicts policy if that needs to be done. There's also not a confidentiality procedure or process in the current bylaws, and our recommendation is that we need one, and you can see what is written here. Article 10 is regarding procedural guidelines, and a number of other local boards do this. All the ticky-tacky stuff about how you host a meeting or put the agenda together or whatever it may be, that would be in operating procedural guidelines. And the board would adopt those outside of the bylaws, but they should be published and available to the members. There's not an indemnification clause in the current bylaws, which gave me some angst. So we have an standard indemnification clause in Article 11. Article 12 is miscellaneous stuff, fiscal year. We're going to follow parliamentary procedure. The president will appoint someone on the board to be the parliamentarian. And Article 13 is dissolution, and I believe that is in the 79 bylaws. I can check that if anyone wants me to. But if for some reason the ECA dissolved, which I sure hope never happens, but if it did, and there were assets, they would need to be distributed to qualified organizations, most likely to fulfill the purposes of ECA. And then Article 14. Oh, I've messed up the number here. Okay, it's Article 14. I'll fix that on my summary. I've got Article 4. I promise that's not an Easter egg. I was not waiting for someone else to find my mistake. I didn't do that on purpose. The procedure to amend the bylaws by majority vote of members present at an annual or special meeting. And then the effective date would be upon adoption. And as Wes said, we would really like to get this done before September so that we can have these in place, refile the articles of incorporation with a proper statement of our nonprofit status. So this is a cleanup kind of a document. It is not any comment whatsoever on people who served on the ECA board for many, many years. And people who wrote these bylaws, as I said, Leslie Winter, who doesn't live in Charlotte anymore, she was a dear, dear friend. And she had been a state senator. She's amazing. The general counsel of the University of North Carolina system for a while. She's incredible. But the world has changed, and they're just things they didn't think of then. And I know that there was, as I said, work done on the bylaws in the 80s and 90s, and we just can't find it. And we're a volunteer organization. People move, people take stuff with them, they clean out their attics, they throw stuff away. It's the way it goes. But we're trying to get our ducks in a row, as they say, and then keep it all on a Google Drive. So Google's never going away, right, West? West works for Google, if y'all don't know that. Be on a Google Drive so that it's available to subsequent generations when I am long gone. So
or whatever storage medium that is appropriate for the time.
Mm-hmm. So if y'all ask something I can't answer, I will take it down, or I'll try to. Let's see. Can you ask who the specialist lawyer was?
I tell you what. I'll read the questions for you, Sarah, and that'll give you a mild break. And then and also make sure we have the question in the video as well, since the questions won't be present in the video for that we post on YouTube. So first, less of a question. It's from Betsy Walsh. Betsy says, I appreciate all the work that's gone in the revision of the bylaws. It's a tremendous amount of work and can be quite thankless, so thank you. Betsy,
Thanks.
like I was saying earlier, Sarah is the one to thank. She has done the lion's share of the work here, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks.
Okay.
I won't say it was fun, but it was good to do.
And the next question we have is from Ken. Ken, thank you. Ken Lamla, thank you for your questions. And this was, can we see he was on the call? That I'll be frank with you. I do not use Zoom very often, and I don't know to answer that question. In this particular one, I'll just for posterity, there's about a little less than 20. So from the board, we have Teddy, myself, Evan Kettler, Sarah, of course, Paul Shipley, and I think Lauren Gomez. I'll just see Lauren, but Lauren Gomez is our membership director. Also, we have Shirley Lynn, Rick Berry, Mickey McDonough, Mel Sizemore, Jeremy Deese, Ellen Hoover, Betsy Walsh, Betsy Berkner, Beth H., and Aldra Green, and of course, Ken Lamla. Those are the current attendees right now. If they came and went, then they might not be on this list right now. So that's who I'm on call right now. And Ken also asked Sarah, question for you because I don't know the answer to this, is who was the specialist lawyer?
He is Christian Cherry, and he's with the law firm Crisp, Cherry, and McGraw.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for the question. Ken, again, Ken says, I do think it is appropriate to revisit the purposes of the ECA with the new context of the neighborhood. Sarah, you want to take first step?
We agree with that, Ken, but it seemed like that was more than a one-person job, and one person sort of needed to take charge of doing as much of the bylaws as we could do now. And we totally agree that we should have a committee that revisits the purposes, but we think that's going to take quite a bit of time. And in the meantime, we want to get in place what we can do right now.
It took us several years to get to this point because of all the different things that have happened. Yeah, I agree with you too, Ken. I do think, and we'd like as much neighborhood input as we can get for that too, is the other thing I'll add to what Sarah said.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that comment. All right, next one is from Jeremy Deese. His question is, the revised bylaws say that nominating committee is made up of 2 members the president selects. Are those just ECA members, or are they ECA board members? I assume the meaning here is, oh yeah, so they have to be a member of the ECA for sure. Mm-hmm. But he's asking, do they have to be a board member as well? And then the second part of the question is, should we consider making the nominating committee a randomly selected group to avoid any one president's imprint on the board continuing for too long past their tenures?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Boy, I'm glad there are lawyers on this call because I knew there would be detailed questions. And also let me know when and if you find typos, which we have read this and read this. So the question about the composition of the nominating committee, as you see in Article 8.2B, don't you just love it? The past president chairs a nominating committee, and there are 2 additional members, and they can be members of the board or members of the ECA. They don't have to be members of the board. So I don't know about a randomly selected group. I'm not exactly sure how that would occur because these people need to know the neighborhood and they need to know people and be good talent spotters and evaluators. So that's not something we considered, and it's really not something that I would recommend, having been someone who's tried to solicit people for the board. where we also try to find people who, you know, have interests that fill a need that needs to be filled on the board. So if you want to come sit on my board porch and talk about this more, I'd be happy to do it, Jeremy. But that's my answer right now.
All right. Ken.
Oh, I will say that no member of the nominating committee is eligible to be a candidate for an officer position unless it's specifically permitted by the board. And that would be, the way it's written, that would be the rare exception. Okay.
From Ken Lamley again. Article 8, when is the annual budget for committees made public?
I don't know the answer to that. That's probably more of a Danielle question than a me question.
Danielle is our treasurer for those that are, it's not secret now. I think we can share that without any problem if you're interested, Ken. Article 10, again from Ken. Article 10, the procedural guidelines should be in the bylaws, especially how open the meetings are.
Well, Ken, you know, that's just something we disagree on because we're trying to get into nitty-gritty procedural guidelines here, like how far in advance of a meeting do you have to send out a notice and you have to amend the notice and who drafts the agenda, because those things could change and it's hard to change bylaws as it should be. But right now we don't have procedural guidelines. So it's a vast improvement to have them, and it'll be interesting to write. West, can't wait to see who you asked to write those procedural guidelines, and they will be published and be available on the website.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'll add one note is that, and Ken, you know this well, and many people on this call know it. The ECA is a volunteer organization, and one of the things I really try not to do is bog down people's time any more than we need to. Want to let them do what they're passionate about if I can, and so we can do as much good in the neighborhood as we can. It's just kind of a related statement. And Ken comments, good effort. Still some questions need to be resolved. Agreed. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. Thank you, Ken. And from Betsy Walsh. Thank you, Betsy, for your question. I know you have some expertise here. She says, thank you again for all the thoughtful work and for modernization of these really old bylaws. Can you please share the thinking around a few elements? And I'll read these out and feel free to parse through as I go here, Sarah. Number one, term limits for board members. She says most nonprofits have term limits in my experience. The second one she asked about is, what section addresses member access to board minutes and other records? The old bylaws had language around open access in section 4.10. And then the third point is nominating process. Did you consider requiring the committee to include non-board members to ensure you're getting the perspective of the membership outside of the board? In parentheses, some bylaws for member organizations have membership elect the chair or members of the nominating committee. Also, why is the size of the nominating committee set at 3? So technically the 4th. All very good questions.
Yeah, I'll do my best on these, Betsy, and if I can't answer them, I know we're recording this, and this Q&A will be recorded, right, Wes, so we could get answers out to people. Boy, the executive committee and the board really hashed out your question, number one, on term limits. I know that, you know, some nonprofits, Council for Children's Rights, things like that, they have term limits. I used to chair their board in the 1990s. But our thinking was that we want to make sure to have people fill positions who are passionate about it and doing a great job and have the time. And if that's someone like, I keep talking about John McBride, but John's been on the board for a number of years. He does the newsletter. He has a very specific interest and talent. And to tell John, well, you can do the newsletter for 2 terms, but then you're out, seems to be shooting the organization in the foot. So that's our thinking there, is that we're a volunteer organization and we're subject somewhat to people's availability and interest. And if we have a gem of a person who's doing a great job, that they should not be forced to leave the board because they're term limited. Betsy, I cannot find the old bylaws, this language around open access, and I'm looking at I can't find 4.10. I apologize, but I'm thinking on my feet here too. So board minutes are available, and that would certainly be in the operating guidelines. But if that's something that you all feel like we need to add, I mean, they are available. So, okay, the nominating process. Number 3, did you consider requiring the committee to include non-board members? It doesn't require non-board members, but it could include non-board members. We thought that was really the president's call to ensure you're getting the perspective of members on the board. Yeah, so that's a consideration. We thought about that. That could happen. It doesn't have to be board members except for the chair, who is the president-elect. The size of the nominating committee is set at 3 because that seems to be a nimble number, but they are not precluded from consulting other people, which Paul Shipley, who's been chairing the nominating committee, does all the time.
Yeah, and your points are well taken too, Betsy. And we have included some folks outside of in this current round, and we're also trying to include other people in the activities, but not as a voting member of that nominating committee, kind of as we speak. So, very good points you made. All right, all set with that question, Sarah?
Mm-hmm.
Beth H, is it appropriate to include the bylaws that ECA must? Is it appropriate to include in the bylaws that the ECA must hold directors and officers at insurance as well as general liability insurance?
We could certainly add that.
I do agree we should, and we do.
Okay, will do.
We'll think about that one, yeah. Okay,
Oh,
cool.
good. Ken's volunteering to be on the committee on purposes.
All right, Ken, thank you for the volunteer. We would love to have you.
And he can do it in a hurry. That's great, Ken. I thought I could do the bylaws in 3 weeks too, but that'd be great.
Ken says he doesn't think the purpose should take a lot of time. And another question from Jerry Matisse. Well, he says, sorry, he did not mean to randomly select a committee of board members, or randomly selected board member. Oh, he meant a randomly selected committee of board members, or a randomly selected board member who selects the other committee members and then they proffer the nominees. Okay, Thank you for the clarification, Chairman.
You know, Jeremy, in a lot of the bylaws that I read, that was the role of the past president. And it seemed to make sense in this case, knowing the past presidents that I know, that the person who would be in the past president position really understands this neighborhood, understands the organization, understands what it takes to lead. And then that person is not a candidate for an officer position again. So it's a pretty unique position to chair the nominating committee. And they go into it knowing that's what they're doing. And it doesn't change. So I think that was persuasive to me in it being the job of the past president. People can differ on that. Organizations do it differently. That's where the executive committee landed. And we talked about this for a long time. This is not Sarah Crowder just saying, okay, guys, here's how we're going to do it. That's where we landed.
Thank you for the question, Jeremy.
Okay, Paul had a comment.
Yeah, Paul does a comment. Ken makes a comment that not having procedural guidelines allow people to be excluded.
Well, we're going to have procedural guidelines.
Yep, agreed. Shirley Lynn, she says, great work, very consistent with other nonprofit bylaws. Important to not over detail the bylaws as times will change. I
Totally agree, Shirley. Totally agree.
Ken likes Betsy Walsh's questions. We did too. Thank you, Betsy. Betsy comments, it says open books and records. Well, Betsy, maybe we can, she's talking about the 4.10. I think she's referring to that piece. Betsy, let's connect on this one afterwards and see.
Let's do.
Perhaps you have some additional materials that we're not privy to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. Thank you, Betsy. Beth H says, thank you to all for this Herculean effort and also for all the great questions from our amazing neighbors. I second that. Thank you all for being here tonight and for asking great questions. When you have more questions, it's a great segue too. If you have more questions, please send it to, you can either send it directly to Sarah via her email if you have it, or send it to president@elizabethcommunity.com, and I'll make sure that we all take a peek and integrate that feedback into the next draft.
And Betsy, I'm seeing your Article 7, paragraph 4. I got it. Okay. Got it. Thanks, Betsy.
That's the last question you were just referring to, right? Yep. So that question, just for the video, is sorry for on incorrect reference. The current bylaws, Article 7, paragraph 4, states all books and records of the corporation may be inspected by any member for any proper purpose at any reasonable time. And that's a good thing to have. I like that.
Of course, we keep records differently than we used to. They refer to the office of the registered office. We would not do it this way, but we can certainly incorporate something like this.
Mel Sizemore, she says, I think Ken is excellent for developing the purposes. Loved how he led the development of the purposes in the last Elizabeth area plan. Agreed. Thank you, Ken, for that. Appreciate everything else you've done for the neighborhood over the many years. And last is a thank you from Ken for the meeting and the effort to update the bylaws. Sarah,
thanks,
thank
Ken.
you. And thank you to all the board members. And thank you for everyone that's provided feedback now. I really want to have an in-person meeting so that this can be a more dynamic conversation. So that's really the purpose of that second meeting. This is really, in this meeting, we wanted to kind of get process started, get the information out around the thinking around the different adjustments and adds and changes to the bylaws so that everybody could review those before we dove in and had a more in-depth discussion. I'd also encourage, Betsy Walsh, great example with you. You have great feedback, very specific feedback. We value that a lot. Please, if you shoot Sarah an email, she's the best point person for this, or me, of course. And we'd love to sit down with you at some point and hash through it, because there's a lot of really smart people in this neighborhood, and we want to get their input if we can. And Betsy Bergner says, thank you everyone for the hard work. Sarah, thank you for your clarity.
Full disclosure, Betsy's a good friend, so she had to say that, but thank you, Betsy. It's been a good effort. And, I'll just close with saying no one really cares about bylaws until you need them. When something goes wrong or there's a question, and man, you really need them. So we want to get these cleaned up and their governance to be clear, so they're just not questions about how the board's operating. It's important.
Exactly. Thank you, Sarah, so much.
Happy to do it. I love this neighborhood. Y'all know that. We've been here 40-something years. We love it.
That's right. We really appreciate you, Sarah. And if you ever need to talk to Sarah, all you have to do is walk by her house on a nice day, and she's usually out there gardening.
I'll give you tomatoes.
No, and she gives you produce. It's a great walk. So I'll go ahead. We're about 50 minutes in, and usually meetings run long, but I'm thinking that we're going to end early this evening, which is great. So in closing, I want to kind of run through the timeline real quick. Again, this meeting is kind of the first step. We will take the feedback that we got tonight from the questions, as well as additional feedback that we get either in person or via email or by whatever means. Please send it to us before May 3rd, 2023, if you can, so that we can think about it, integrate it, and talk about it as a board in our next meeting. Once we get the next draft put together, we'll send that out to the neighborhood, aiming for around the second week of May. And then we'll set up a final meeting to review that final draft and hopefully move to a vote at that point. We'll hold that vote open and allow email voting as well. I really like that, again, because it is as inclusive as possible to all members. And then assuming it passes, we'll have a new set of bylaws and we'll adopt those, which will also govern our new election, which I think is also a good thing. We had a minor crisis during COVID when we couldn't meet in person, and we had to come up with a whole new set of rules. And that was another Herculean effort by Sarah when she was president to put all that together. Thank you, Sarah. We used that for 2 elections, however many it's been since then. It all runs together. If there's no other comments, Sarah, I will say thank you to everyone and bid you good evening. I'll close the meeting. It's 7:23 p.m. and I appreciate everyone's time, and I'll say good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.